Harvey Milk was one of the most influential leaders of the gay rights movement in the 1970s. Milk was able to become such a strong leader because of the powerful rhetoric he used during his time campaigning. He was a political pioneer, becoming one of the first gay people to be elected to an office in the United States, and his mere election to office started a culture war that would have to change his entire face of American politics forever. Because of his efforts, LGBT visibility increased dramatically in the media, and an establishment of LGBT discourse was spurred due to his election to office. He made a point to not only focus on the gay rights exclusively, but also to fight for the rights of all of those who were oppressed. By presenting himself as someone who could fight for the rights, he fostered a community of followers that believed in Milk's ideas. Milk supported all of the oppressed during his campaign, and he worked during his short time in office to help make San Francisco a safer and more accepting city for all people. We aim to create a narrative of Milk's life and examine and analyze the rhetoric he employed during his political life.
Harvey Milk was born on May 22, 1930 in Woodmere, New York to a small middle-class Jewish family. He was a good student, and after high school he went to school to become a teacher at New York State College for Teachers, and afterwards joined the U.S. Navy, serving as a diving instructor for a time. After the Navy, he moved to New York City and took on many jobs. He befriended a group of gay radicals and decided to start afresh in San Francisco, starting a store called Castro Camera on Castro Street, putting him directly in the center of San Francisco's gay community. As his shop became more and more popular, and he in turn grew in popularity as well, many people started to identify with his political beliefs very strongly. In 1973, he decided to run for San Francisco Board of Supervisors, but lost. He tried again 2 years later and narrowly lost again, and finally in 1977 he won, having at this point very strong connections with San Francisco's liberal mayor George Moscone and other Democratic politicians. On January 8, 1978, he became one of the first gay people to be elected to political office. He started to actively respond to Anita Bryant, who campaigned for the repeal of the gay rights ordinance in Dade County, Florida, and created the Save Our Children movement. The Save Our Children movement was the first organized movement that openly opposed the gay rights movement by allowing employers to fire gay teachers because gay people were seen as recruiters of children based on the fact that they couldn't reproduce on their own. His efforts helped stop the creation of Proposition 6, which would allow these teachers to be fired in California. Unfortunately, in a little less than a year, both Milk and Mayor Moscone were assassinated by fellow city supervisor Dan White. White originally resigned from his position because of low pay and later came back to City Hall to try and be reappointed to his position, but Moscone refused. White then killed Moscone, followed by Milk, presumably because Milk had convinced Moscone to ignore White's request for reappointment. Milk's death and eventually White's feeble criminal sentencing, 7 years for manslaughter, caused violent riots to break out, the White Night Riots, among LGBT San Francisco residents, resulting in over 100 injuries.
Although he died tragically, Harvey Milk displayed himself through his political life as a person who could lead by proving that he was a necessity as a gay man in office in order for the gay rights movement and other civil rights movements to be evaluated in a society where those movements were primarily silenced. Harvey used cultural illusion, humor, and colloquial diction and powerful imagery to get elected and to become such a timeless leader for the LGBT community. He was able to win the hearts of so many by presenting himself as a platform for oppressed voices to finally be heard, and by being gay himself, he knew and understood oppression, and he knew that the only way to fight the majority was to round up the minority forces.
In many ways, Harvey alluded to the efforts of other minorities in his speeches during his political campaign. In one instance, he mentioned how the black community had made up its mind about allowing other people to represent them in office, and had therefore decided that the myths against blacks could only be dispelled by electing black leaders. These cultural allusions allowed him to express his strong empathy for minority rights, and Harvey realized that the only way for LGBT voices to be heard would be for LGBT leaders to be elected to public office. He recognized that electing LGBT-friendly officials would be important for the movement, but he also knew that the only way to catalyze the movement would be for someone who was actually LGBT to lead. By having someone gay in office, non-LGBT citizens would be forced to judge leaders, rather than the supposed sex offenders that Anita Bryant and the rest of the religious right claimed LGBT people to be. Instead of being villainized, putting up a strong leader for office who would be a fixture of the LGBT movement would finally bring about a discussion of rights. In his famous Hope speech, delivered in 1978, a couple months after winning office, Milk emphasized that friends can't feel the anger and frustration. They can sense it in us, but they can't feel it, because a friend has never gone through what is known as coming out. He makes direct references to the Black Rights Movement, claiming that the first gay politicians must not be content with sitting in the back of the bus. By directly referencing the movement, he can appeal to his black constituents, letting them know that their efforts have paved the way for similar movements at the time. Milk paints the Black Civil Rights Movement as an excellent model for the LGBT movement to follow, and which the movement should honor. He also connects his argument to the black community to provide people context of the kind of struggles gays are experiencing as something similar to that of the black community. Milk appealed directly to minorities other than his own by drawing on their emotions and their collective consciousness of the times. He wanted to be not only the gay person's politician, but the everyman's politician.
In his speeches, Milk also used a fair amount of humor to gain rapport with his audiences. This humor gave him an opportunity to establish himself as a candidate that did not care much for the formalities of public office life, and as a candidate that would much rather connect well with that of his constituents. In his 1977 speech announcing his candidacy for city supervisor, he quipped, "I've been running for so many things for so long in this city that I wear a pair of sneakers." People do not sympathize and connect with a cold, distant politician, and Milk knew that. He knew that his constituents wanted someone who dared to be charismatic and approachable, and Milk was exactly that. By employing a colloquial tone, his supporters could better empathize with him and perceive him as someone they could trust in office, someone that could understand where they were coming from, and someone who could help alleviate the pain of their plight. In a world where the LGBT were persecuted for their mere existence, his humor provided a comic relief of sorts for when it was time to discuss the dismal situations gay rights had been in at the time.
Through both his 1977 and 1978 speeches, he uses the images of the green light and the door, more specifically the closet door, to show how his position as an official has opened up many opportunities for the oppressed communities. In the first speech, where he was still campaigning, he says that he's watched 1 million people close their closet doors behind them and knows that they cannot go back. Here, it seems that the closet doors are a trap that people cannot escape. There seems to be no sign of a future of hope or liberation for those who are stuck in the closet. But in his second speech, after he got elected, he mentions that if a gay person makes it, the doors are open to everyone. Since his election, there is a sense of liberation with the idea of a door, and not just for the gay community, but for everyone. His viewpoint of the election changed the image of the door from being something that traps people inside to something that opens up opportunity. The image of the green light also shows a sense of liberation, playing off the idea of a green light referring to the signal that allows us to move forward at a traffic intersection. In the first speech, he says that if you help me get elected that election, a green light is lit, a green light that says to all who feel lost and disenfranchised that you can now go forward. In this context, the green light seems very promising since he is not yet an official, but it later becomes a reality in the second speech when he says, very definitively, that if a gay person can be elected, then it's a green light. He emphasizes the importance of the election as if getting involved in politics is a liberation in itself because it provides direction and a place for those who are lost and disenfranchised, such as the gay community during this time period, to be heard. The association he makes between the foreign motion that goes along with the idea of the green light and his election helps get across his point of how his involvement in politics as an elected official will help the LGBT community. Using the images of the door and the green light not only gave people hope that there is a possibility of a life where they could be free, but also made them believe that Milk was the one who could get them there.
Harvey Milk knew that his election was essential to the LGBT movement. In a nation full of advocates like Anita Bryant preaching for the exclusion of members of the LGBT community, Milk was able to rise above the critics using his strong rhetorical tactics and his powerful message of hope. He inflated his cause in the public eye by alluding it to the civil rights movement, exemplifying why he, a member of the LGBT community, was the person they needed in office. Milk's clever use of humor added humanity to his speeches, setting him apart from the other unrelatable, strictly political candidates. For his third notable tactic, Milk used hopeful images of green lights and open doors, creating a vision of forward-moving, safe, and open future for his constituents. It was the combination of these tactics that allowed him to truly become one of the most recognizable gay leaders in recent history.